in London. My parents came over in 68 and 72. And yeah, I've always been led to think of Hong Kong as my home as well, even though I've never lived there. And the way it's informed my work is it's created this sense of an in-between identity. So a lot of my work sort of fluctuates, in between these sorts of spaces. Whether is it a painting or isn't it a painting, and to philosophically explore and create those sorts of spaces. What is natural, artificial, and what does it mean to be human? In a way that's rooted in what is my identity. I think these are the landscapes in which we all exist in, and I wanted to find a way to depict that in my art. Why? Because it informs the way that we live and who we are, and it's a search and a way to try to understand, oneself by working out, I suppose, what world it is that we're living in. And so by looking into, for example, the past, histories, you can reconsider your present reality and perhaps think about how to build towards the future. Well, I began using the Financial Times stock listings in my work in the 90s. And it was to reflect on what I felt was these new landscapes that were coming about through the digital and communications revolution. So, for example, the rise of the internet. It was enormously impactful, on the world. Information traveling at the speed of light across, to the other side of the world. And wherever within the finance world or capitalism, this technology accelerated that, by magnitudes. And wherever these trillions that were moving in an instant, they were carving out these utopias and dystopias in this kind of digital dimension that I was imagining. The point of the financial crisis in 2008, I started looking at the first economic bubble, and led me to looking at tulip mania and the speculation over tulips, at the peak of which they sold for the price of a house before they collapsed. And then by extension from there, I started looking at still life paintings from the Dutch Golden Age, which happened to be the birth of modern capitalism. And then I discovered this algorithm that could reorder the pixels without erasing or destroying them. So theoretically, all the images that I use this algorithm on, they could be reassembled back to its original state. And for me, this is a metaphor of rhyming histories, or a new order, or a new world order, and how histories repeat, through time. Part of my work is, I guess, over the decades has been a journey to trying to understand, the mechanisms of power or the shape of it. And that means, looking at history beyond that which is given to us, through our education, etc. There's a philosopher that says that history instructs. The idea being that history is written by victors. So being written by victors means that it's not necessarily telling you the entire truth of, the circumstances. And so by seeking it, we seek to understand, the reality of the real nature of power, and why power mobilizes in this circumstance and in this context, in geopolitics, nation states and its people and its productivity into perhaps convincing them to capture, other people's lands and resources for an ideological satisfaction, in order to extract that wealth, not only from the taxpayer, but also the nation states or the sovereign states that they're capturing, into private hands. And so once we comprehend those sorts of mechanisms, it helps us to understand the nature of who and why and how they're ruling over us. Yeah, so the painting that you're referring to there is part of a series called The Course of Empire, which is from Thomas Coles. And it's a fictional sort of imaging or painting, a set of paintings of the rise and fall of civilization. So it begins with like, I believe it's the savage state, Arcadian, otherwise called pastoral, to consummation, and then destruction and desolation, which is the one behind you. And it's a very romanticized idea of like a cycle of civilization. And of course, back then, it was about civilizing. And that's really a euphemism for conquering. And so by defining a people that were on a land, either as, I don't know, heretics or, not even people really, but actually savages, for example, it gives you then the so-called civilizational force, the justification to then go and civilize them. In other words, take away their land, and often in the name of God, in those times. So, for example, a lot of the American sublime paintings, I remember seeing this in a giant group exhibition at the Tate. I was like thinking, well, where's all the, American Indians that were there and stuff? More often than not, it's a tiny little gentleman, Euro-American, that's in the corner. And it's there as a pictorial device to amplify the epic majesty of the natural landscape. And we're meant to then philosophically sort of like, be overwhelmed, by this kind of nature, the power of it. But it's a symbol of God, in the context of these paintings. And so the messaging is that you are doing God's work by taking the land. I've been having people sort of tell me about how they connect to the work through different sort of entry points. But like you've already suggested, there are a multiplicity of like, viewpoints in a sense. And I am working with all sorts of different ideas, whether that exists in a technical dimension just, the aesthetics, the concepts, the histories, art history, and even geopolitics and history itself. So there's lots of points, entry points, through the work. But overall, I think a lot of the work that I make, it's always at its core a search for beauty, and it's a beauty in humanity itself. And that for me is hope, that there can be, something, always, better. For a long time, I was reading as a student all this art theory, and I would maybe be able to digest, even after 7 years of reading it, maybe a few sentences and paragraphs here and there. And then my cousin one day said to me, "You should be reading novels." It took me a year to throw out the art theory, and I started reading people like Philip K. Dick and J.G. Ballard and all these science fiction sort of writers. And this enormous creative sort of dam sort of broke inside my head. And I was flooded with all this inspiration and joy and wonder. And that really propelled me sort of right forward into all sorts of aesthetic sort of pursuits, and gave me an enormous amount of like emotional courage, to pursue whatever is interesting, to me. And so things like science fiction films as well, Blade Runner, Matrix, Stanley Kubrick's 2001. All of these are like perfect philosophical conversations made in the most magnificent, beautiful, multiple technical devices, camera work, film, script, so much, and then I would like go through periods of like listening to YouTube nerds, talking about it and discussing it at length and opening my eyes up, to the many sort of like processes and structures and techniques and thinking that went into, you know, these films and books. So yeah, always like trying to fill your mind with like, you know, inspiring sort of spaces.